After narrowly surviving his deadly duel with Charles Dickinson in 1806, Andrew Jackson spent 3 months recuperating. He began studying military strategies, hoping to one day prove his abilities as Major General of the Tennessee Militia. When the United States declared war against Britain in 1812, no one wanted to be part of the fight more than Jackson. Even though military commanders in Washington had doubts about the militia, Jackson was ordered to march his 2,000 volunteers toward the port of New Orleans in preparation for a possible British landing and assault. Jackson and his troops set out in January 1813. It took 3 months to cover the first 500 miles. But when the army arrived in Natchez, then part of the Mississippi Territory, Jackson received infuriating news.
He got an order to disband the troops. They weren't needed, and to send them home. The War Department didn't want the troops there. The War Department didn't want to pay to march them back, to provision and march them back. And Jackson was outraged by all of this. How are they going to get home? They didn't have any money. Many of them were sick. So Jackson did what Jackson was pretty good at doing under similar circumstances. He simply defied the orders. And he announced that he was going to march the troops home himself.
A father figure to his troops, most of whom were not yet 20 years old, Jackson paid for provisions out of his own pocket to get his boys home.
Dienheimer Geierscheid, ein Teil von der Dienheimer Saar and Oppenheimer Grötenbrunnen und Oppenheimer Kette.
I'd never heard my uncle speak German before. I didn't even know he could.
Ungefähr zweimal im Monat mit dem Fahrrad.
Not until we spent time together visiting Oppenheim.
Ride your bike a lot?
Ja, ich denke 3-4 Stunden am Tag.
The small city on the Rhine where he and my mother grew up.
And you used to ride your bike out to the vineyards with your father?
Yeah.
I've known about Oppenheim for as long as I can remember, from stories I heard from my mother. Stories that were to a boy growing up in Waterbury, Connecticut, part fairy tale, part fever dream.
Dann wird das Ergebnis der Siegesblutung sein, sondern die Vernichtung der Juden in der Rasse in Europa.
Oppenheim was actually settled by Romans almost 2,000 years ago as a fortified outpost, where you can still find evidence of that history in the ancient walls and streets that bear stones once used by Roman builders. It was the Romans who cultivated the grapes that gave rise to the vineyards you see today, that helped give Oppenheim its identity as a wine city, an identity it still enjoys to this day. When he moved here about 10 years ago, the architect Heribert Hamann was dismayed by what he found, or rather didn't find, in his adopted hometown of Oppenheim.
You were entering the bunker, and you see here was a gas-proof door.
It was always a part of our identity. Identity as Oppenheimers is also influenced by Jewish identity.
And so now you're literally within the outer walls of the synagogue. We are now in the bunker.
And the Nazis destroyed all documents, all plans, all photographs. So we lost a part of our own identity by losing the Jewish community.
His dream of recovering this lost identity led him to my Uncle Martin from California, a teenager when Nazis burned the synagogue to the ground.
Brown versus Board of Education was a critically important case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954. But when the Legal Defense Fund first became involved in it, no one was completely confident pursuing the case was the right move.
Our greatest fear was that, we could lose it. And then where would we be? In fact, there were blacks who argued that we shouldn't go ahead and push this issue of segregation per se. We had dropped separate but equal.
The Supreme Court's unanimous decision in their favor shocked Motley and her colleagues. They thought that at best, the decision would be split 5-4 or 6-3. Instead, the court unanimously agreed that segregation and separate but equal were unconstitutional and that integration should begin with all due haste.
Thurgood Marshall was in the courtroom that day. He called me and told me. It was so awesome, everybody was just pretty much subdued. After a while, after a long pause, maybe half a day or so, we began celebrating. But it was just too cosmic to have any predictable reaction.
We never thought it would be unanimous. That was our only surprise. And that was the result of Warren, Earl Warren's determination that it be unanimous. Because he was right. If it were divided, the South would continue to fight. Because they had hope. This way they had no hope. And so they resorted to massive resistance anyway.
La política es como una invasión hacia la cultura de ellos, ¿no? Y los confunden y los manejan. Entonces, es complicado, no sé, para mí no me parece, ¿no? Me parece que la política que actualmente usan, como la utilizan, me parece como muy agresiva hacia la cultura indígena, pues, que es delicada. Porque ya la cultura de la política viene con intenciones y ambiciones, ¿eh? Entonces viene como que a adaptarse a la gente. Y como se practica y se practica y se sigue practicando y la gente lo va como aceptando cada vez más, aceptando y se va involucrando cada vez más dentro de la política.
Another early use of the common and undivided lands was as a burial ground.
From the beginning of the settlement, people began to pass away from illness, old age, and the normal causes of death. And they were buried behind the meeting house on the green. Well, as time went on, there were thousands and thousands of people buried there. Until finally, in the 1790s, James Hillhouse came up with the idea of a cemetery just outside the 9 squares on Grove Street. After 20 years, the remaining stones were all taken to the Grove Street Cemetery, but the bones or whatever remains of the people who were buried there is still there on the upper green, at least 5,000 of them.
The marketplace was also the location to carry out punishment, meted out for violations of the law.
The stocks and the whipping post were on the green. Much of the punishment was public humiliation. And so shaming rituals, whether being made to stand in the stocks or be in the pillory, were very common types of punishment.
In 1665, New Haven Colony was absorbed by the neighboring Connecticut Colony. When New Haven became co-capital with Hartford in 1701, the first of 3 state houses was built on the marketplace and was in use by 1719.
The second one, which is the historic one that served during the Revolution, was on the site of the present Trinity Church, and finally in 1828, the grand Greek temple-style state house.
Which was designed by the important local architect Ithiel Town, which stood at the northwestern edge of the green, pretty much in front of Yale's Phelps Gate.
By the time the European colonists declared their independence, Long Island Sound had become a critical passageway between Boston and New York. Its strategic importance was not lost on the British, who threw their mighty navy into a blockade of the Sound. Their land forces eventually captured New York City and Long Island. But a stubborn nature, skill, and sheer bravery kept the Connecticut side annoyingly out of reach. From their side of the Sound, the Patriots would periodically send a small party in a whaleboat to kidnap a British officer and ransom him for an ally. One spying mission left a young American captain prisoner of the British. From Long Island, he spoke the words, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country."
Sanger began publishing a monthly newspaper advocating birth control as a means for the emancipation of women. Letters from women across the country poured in. Dear Mrs. Sanger, I am only 34 years old and have given birth to 12 children, only 3 of them living. My husband is a good, hard-working man, but we are poor people, Mrs. Sanger, and the coffins of the last 2 are not paid for yet. Dear Mrs. Sanger, I hate to bother you, but I am desperate. I am the mother of 17 children. I can still face more pregnancies, for I am only 35 years old. And truly, if that happens again, I know I shall be desperate enough to either try abortion or commit suicide.
In colonial America, doctoring was a profession that physicians and patients today would find close to unrecognizable. Medicine, or physic, as it was called, was based on ancient concepts of health and illness. Physicians commonly treated patients by bleeding them or inducing vomiting. What surgery there was took place without anesthesia. A doctor's bag at the time of the Revolutionary War contained only a few rudimentary medications. That's all there were. Foxglove, known today for its essential ingredient, digitalis, to steady an ailing heart. Opium to relieve pain, ginger to aid the digestion. Even the notion of infection was absent from medicine, since the knowledge that germs cause disease would not be advanced until more than a century after the Declaration of Independence. A doctor's work was more art than science, and in most cases, not very good art at that. In colonial America, most people received their medical care in the home. They often turned to ministers for healing, 18th century doctoring being primarily rooted in faith. Early American settlers saw direct ties between their physical health, or lack thereof, and their spiritual well-being. The average life expectancy was only 35 years of age, in large part because as many as 30% of infants and young children succumb to illness. Anyone during this time could call himself a doctor, since there were no licensing requirements.
In 1906, Alois Alzheimer, a German neuropathologist, presented groundbreaking findings to his medical colleagues in Tübingen, Germany. He had studied a middle-aged woman confined to an asylum for several years, suffering memory loss, confusion, and hallucinations. After her death, Alzheimer examined her brain and, using new laboratory techniques, saw clumps of abnormal proteins, plaques, and tangles everywhere.
We've known it as an entity for about 100 years. Almost certainly, it has been around many centuries, but few people live to the age at which they become vulnerable to Alzheimer's disease. So it was rare and not necessarily recognized.
The concept of a dementia that was not due to head trauma or gunshot wounds or syphilis or alcoholism or something else was really radical, and that's why Alzheimer's description was so provocative and heralded at the time. What has happened in the subsequent 100 years is that life expectancy has nearly doubled.
This is really the first generation, if you will, in the history of the world to get old.
It's a dire situation. We have a company that wants to shut us down.
We're just a poster child of what happened to the newspaper industry.
Other papers all around the country are also suffering the same problems.
When a community loses its daily newspaper, I think it really loses a significant part of its identity.
They get these anonymous calls saying, "Oh good, I'm glad you're dead."
This is bad for civic discourse.
How did it get this far along? What caused this to happen?
It is going to make the country harder to govern, harder to understand.
We're going through a geological event.
Everything in our lives are being changed dramatically by technology.
We've lost the distinction between the people who create it and the people who consume it.
Online newspapers do have credibility issues.
We're in a time of transition.
There's a lot of ways you can get news these days, but there's very few where you can get real good reporting.
It's not newspapers, it's news, and people are always going to need it. So somehow, we're still going to do it. How? Who knows?